Welcome to MacGyver's Workshop, where you never know what we're going to be working on next. If you're not too careful, you just might learn something.
Hi there, and welcome to MacGyver's Workshop, where you never know what we're going to be working on next, and if you're not too careful, you just might learn something. All right, so today we've got our engine back from the machine shop and got all our other bits and bobs and such, and I'll be taking you through that and taking you through the short block build and all that good stuff. But first, lots of cleaning and prep work we have to do ahead of time. So let's get started on building our short block. Nowadays they use more of a pressure wash type system. They don't, or at least I haven't found anybody that actually does the old school hot tank or hot dip cleaning that had all the caustic, nasty, toxic chemicals that, I remember back in the 70s and early 80s, you send a machine block off to the machine shop or a head or something, when you got it back, it was bare metal. I mean, there was nothing on it, no schmutz, no gasket material, no nothing. It just cooked everything off. Now it looks like when you get it back, they look like somebody just kind of went over them with a pressure washer. And I mean, they're clean, but it's just not like it used to be. But if the environment and all that, that stuff was terrible for the environment. When they dump those chemicals out or whatever. So we kind of have an extra step now. We got to go through and I know not everybody does it, but this is kind of a pretty project, so we want to take extra care. So I'm going to wire wheel everything and clean everything off real good, scrape off any of the residual gasket material that's still on here, and then first thing I want to do is I want to get a coat of etch primer on it, just to keep the block from rusting anymore, because it is cast iron. It's going to rust in the air. We may have to touch stuff up as we go through. As the next step, we'll be cleaning all the little passages out and everything. I like to just get a coat of get the block cleaned first of all the schmutz, and then get a coat of etch primer on it, and then afterwards, if I get some carb solvent on something, I can touch it up. It's no big deal. But I will say this: when it comes to using a wire wheel or a grinder, I've always been one for safety, and I always wear my safety glasses when I'm working. But I'll tell you what, I'm up in my game because I've always used like these type of safety glasses that, and I have another pair that actually has a little better side shields than this. But this is technically considered a safety glass with side shield. But this is the second time in 6 months that something's gotten past that and gotten my eye. I was working on another project last weekend, and this time I actually had to have eye surgery and get it physically removed. So now, as much as I don't like them in the summertime because they fog up, but I'm going to use them anyway. I'm going to use these type here. I'll come show you that. They're kind of like almost like a swim goggle. They completely go over your face and protect your eyes, so nothing can manage to ricochet in or whatever. But yeah, I had a big old shard taken out of my eyeball. That was not fun. So yeah, don't get complacent when just because you're wearing safety glasses, because that don't mean jack apparently. Anyway, so I'm gonna get to scraping some of this stuff off of here, and then I'll shoot some etch prime on here and get this all cleaned up, and then we'll start going through and cleaning our oil passages out and blowing them out. You always want to do that. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to chase all the threads in all the holes in the block and make sure that you shouldn't have to fight a bolt going in. So it should just roll right in nice and easy. And we'll get going with that. Now we're dealing with like an internal surface on the engine where obviously we're not going to paint it. And what I will do is I will soak me a rag and some WD-40 and wipe it down, and that'll keep any surface rust from forming. You always want to be real careful when you're going through your motor. Make sure you blow everything out and clean everything out. You don't want any bristles ending up in a hole passage somewhere. That wouldn't be good. So you want to try and get as much of this stuff off of here as you can, because if you just sit there and spray your engine paint over this, one, it's going to look like hell, and then two, it's just going to peel off in real short order because it just doesn't really have anything good to stick to there. I'm going to run a tap through all my bolt holes here, make sure all the threads are good and not boogered up or anything like that. And now's the time to do that, not when you're trying to put your motor together or install it in the vehicle. So all you gotta do is just run that down there and just clean those threads up, make sure there's no rust or schmutz in, and you'll be good to go. It's good to have a good set of tap and dies that's got all the different sizes, because you never know what size threads you're going to run into on one of these. And invest in a good set. Don't get a cheap set. If you ever threading a hole in a piece of bar stock or something, you want a good tap and die set. You don't want to bust one of these off in a hole. That's no good. Just always good practice to do this, especially in the cylinder head area. I'm converting this over to have studs instead of just the regular old style head bolts. And you better believe I'm going to be chasing all these threads and make sure they're good before I put those high dollar head studs in there. Head studs are maybe a bit overkill for a regular old street motor, but if you've got one that's inclined to blow head gaskets, which straight six engines are, because you just got this big giant long piece of metal and it'll tend to lift or bow if it overheats. Head studs will help you and keep you out of trouble there, because they'll hold the head down just a little bit better than a head bolt will. You'll notice a couple of these holes have like an extra hole around them, and what that's for is for a dowel that goes in there to help line your head gasket and your cylinder head up when you bolt it on, because that's pretty critical. So we always want to make sure you save those when you take your engine apart. Now you'll notice I'm not using any kind of WD-40 or oil or anything like that, because I'm really just chasing the threads and I'm going to blow them out. If you use any kind of oil, any schmutz or whatever will get stuck in there. So I prefer to always chase the threads dry. Now you're cutting them, that's different. You gotta, you need to use your cutting oil so you don't ruin your tap. But if you're just chasing garbage out of threads, you do it dry, blow it out. Because ARP head studs, they come with a special lubricant you want to put on the threads when you screw them in. And if it's a bolt hole that goes into a water jacket, and you want to put sealer on it. As eventually coolant will wick its way up to the threads, and you don't want that. And you end up with a water leak. There's nothing wrong, quote unquote, with any of these holes, but I was trying to illustrate the importance of chasing all the threads before you go putting your new motor back together. As I'm running down through this head bolt hole here, this thing's kind of fighting me, and the reason it is because, you know, there's just a lot of, you know, schmutz and whatever gook built up in the hole, and over time, you know, that's can be a problem. And where it can be worse of a problem is that the extra torque that it takes to get through here with your head bolt, okay, is going to throw you off, because, you know, your torque wrench is going to be reading that torque that you're fighting against getting down into the threaded hole. And so you could, in theory, torque your head incorrectly and actually not torque it tight enough, and then you wonder why it blows a head gasket, you know, 6 months down the road. Now you watch when I blow out this hole, you see all the schmutz come out of it. That's just normal. I mean, it's rust or gook or whatever. It's built up over the years. Now, this motor here doesn't have any head bolts that go into a water jacket, thankfully. And you can check for that by doing this. And so we don't have to worry about that on this motor, but if we did, we would especially want to get these threads cleaned out, because any of those threads that went into a water jacket are going to have sealer, residual leftover sealer in them, and any corrosion that built up over time as it went up, you know, your water tried to get out through those threads. So always very important step on any engine build. And you can see now, you know, this tap just rolls right in there, no problem. And before, you know, when these other holes, you know, it's really fighting you. You have to, you know, really put some effort behind it to get cut through all that mess. And I'll show you on some places where your T-handle for your tap won't work. Say because you're in close to something that sticks out on the motor, then you can always MacGyver yourself up something like this, which is your 3/8 on one side for your socket, and then you run a 1/4 drive socket in backwards, press it into your 3/8 socket, and then it'll hold your tap for you. So that'll allow you to get in around someplace where the T-handle won't work because it hits. Now you always want to be careful and never get too complacent, especially on a job where you've got like 50 holes that you're cleaning and chasing the threads out. And you never want to get too complacent, because you can still break a tap. And if you do, you're going to be in trouble. I guarantee it. And I broke one and broke it off flush with the top of the motor. And I was just damn lucky I was able to take a nut and lay over the top of it and turn my welder up to nuke factor 4, because the tap is super hard and you're going to have a hard time welding to it. And got just enough decent weld on that nut onto that tap where I was able to back it out, because it was in there too tight and you couldn't tap it around with the punch or anything and there was nothing there you can get on to back it out. So yeah, this could have ended not well. So always want to be super careful and never get too complacent. Not that I did, but yeah, I did. I got too complacent. Got a little too aggressive with it and tink, that was the end of it. So fortunately, that was the last hole, so we're good. Now, we're gonna move on to the next step. Next thing we wanna do is we wanna make sure that all our passages, our oil passages are clear and there's no debris or anything in there that would get into a bearing and score it up. And best thing for it is just regular old brake clean in a can. And go down through all the oil passages and blow them out real good. Now, the oil passages on this motor are very simple, very easy to follow. On a newer modern engine, you know, you might have a little more difficulty, but all these passages are real short. These go from the crankshaft to the camshaft bearings, just a little passage about like that. And then from the camshaft, and it goes through the oil galley to the oil pump. So the pump actually feeds oil to the cam bearings as well as the crank. So it's not like a priority main or anything like that. But it's easy to follow. And it also goes through the lifter bores as well. So we want to make sure we get through all that. Get all this cleaned out real good. And blow them out real nice. We don't want any surprises when we start our motor up. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to wipe down the cylinder bores, because you still need to clean those out even though the machine shop already supposedly did all that. Make sure you get any honing residue out of there. What I like to do is I like to soak my rag with my brake clean and then go down and wipe those bores out real good. But you want to make sure you use the lint-free type rags. Now, these ones are good for that. They're not so good for like wiping your hands and stuff, but for this job, they're perfect because they don't fall apart and they don't make little lint bits that end up in your motor somewhere. Whereas like these rags here, you know, I prefer these for like my hand towels when I gotta wipe my hands off and stuff. But these are like almost like a paper towel on steroids, but they still come apart and leave little bits here and there. So you don't want to use those if you're, you know, wiping out a lifter bore or something like that, or an oil passage, or a cylinder bore in this case. So what I'll do, I'm gonna soak my rag down here real good with this brake clean. I'm going to wipe that cylinder bore out and you're going to see just how much dirt is in that bore, even though it appears to be somewhat clean. So you see that? That's the stuff you get out of there. Now when it comes to laying the crank in, you know, you want to make sure you trust but verify. So what we're going to do we're going to lay all our bearings in, and before we put any assembly lube on here, we'll go get us some plastic gauge and lay the crank in and torque it and double check and see what our bearing clearance is. I mean, it shouldn't be any different because they didn't take any metal out of the crank, they just polished it, and we're going back with standard bearings, so we should be good, but you still want to double check just to be safe. Well, make sure you get this right. The upper main bearing is going to have the hole in it, because that's where your oil passage is in the motor. So, and make sure, of course, that everything is nice and clean and there's no debris. And then what I do is I start from the non-flanged side, and then I push in so my little tab lines up in the hole there. And we'll drop all these puppies in here. And of course, you've got one special bearing in here. It's called a thrust bearing. It not only has the bearing surface it rides on the crank, but you also have a bearing surface here and here, and that's for the crank that moves forward and back. That's kind of important on a manual transmission vehicle, because when you push it on that clutch, you know, you're tending to push the crank forward, or when you're releasing the clutch, then you're letting pressure off, so the crank moves back and forth. And there's actually a limited amount of clearance there too, a specified clearance there, but we'll show you. I do have a dial indicator, and we can measure our end play is what they call it. So, and what we do is we just press that puppy down in there like so. That one's going to fit a little snugger than the main bearings, because you got your sides here to deal with too. All right, there we go. All right, now we'll put these in the caps, and then I'll have to go get me some plastic gauge because I don't have any, and then we'll be back. To check our main bearing clearances here, we're going to use plastic gauge, and comes in a couple different flavors depending on what amount of clearance you're wanting to measure. But for our purposes, we're going to use the green. I think there's green, red, blue, and yellow. This one goes from 1 to 3/1000 of an inch. So we will take and we'll have to lay our crank in here, and then we'll put a little piece of plastic gauge on each bearing surface on the top here. We'll clamp our main caps down to their recommended torque spec, and then we'll remove them and check and see how far each piece of that plastic gauge has squished out. And there's a little reference marks on the side of the package here. I can show you there. And you just kind of compare, you know, the squish with the marks here, and that'll tell you what your clearance is. You know, sometimes if it weren't for weird luck, I wouldn't have any luck at all. I went to open up my piece of plastic, or thing of plastic gauge, and there wasn't a plastic gauge in it. So I had to go run down to the parts store real quick and get a replacement. So now what I'll do here is I'll go ahead and zoom the camera in a little closer so you can see what I'm doing, and get an idea how we use this stuff. We'll take and we'll cut just a little piece of this string, just wide enough to go across the surface of the main bearing, and we want to be able to measure all the way across the bearing, because we want to make sure that the clearance of the bearing is the same all the way across. Now this stuff is really, really, really very fine. So you have to be careful with it. Our bearing is already installed in our rear main cap here. And we very gently set our cap down on here. We don't want to move the plastic gauge around if we can help it, because that will skew our readings. Now you may have to give this main cap a little tap to get it down onto its, to seat it down here. And then we will torque it to its torque spec, which is going to be between 60 and 70 foot-pounds. So we will go with a nominal 65. So we'll bring it up in a couple of stages here. So we want to make sure we draw the cap down nice and even. And we'll take her up to 65 here. All right. Okay, so our plastic gauge stuck to the top of the bearing cap, but that's okay. We take our package here and measure what's roughly close to the squish there. And it looks to be somewhere between that green one but closer to the white one. So that's in between, that's where it's right about, or about 2/1000ths. So that's not bad. That's not bad at all. And we will check the rest of these bad boys. And now you know how to use plastic gauge. How about that, huh? All these measured out right at about 2/1000ths, which I am totally happy with. That's good and tight, which is not surprising really with how the engine was cared for by its original owner. Next, we can go ahead and install our crankshaft, and we will do that by using some of our good assembly lube here and kind of goob these, put a generous amount on the bearing surfaces here, and then we'll kind of spread it around with our fingers when we're done here. Now of course we're going to pre-lube this engine too before we ever try and start it, but you always still want to use your assembly lube, because we're going to be turning it over by hand, you know, between putting the pistons in and all that stuff. So smear that in there real good. Then we'll lay our crank in here. And then we'll lube up the caps, drop them in and torque them down, and we will go from there. You want to make sure that all your caps and everything are lined up properly. Of course, this one's pretty obvious being in the back. And then you want to make sure that each of your other caps, they're all numbered and they have an arrow on them pointing in one direction, which goes towards the front of the motor. So now we know that this one's, let's see, 1, 2, 4, 5, 6. So we know that this one goes here, and we keep our arrow pointing that way, and we know we're good. Now this one has our thrust bearing in it, so we're going to want to make sure we lube up both sides of the thrust bearing surface as well. Take the liberty of throwing a little bit in there on that crank too, just for good measure. We make sure our arrow is pointing in the right direction. And we'll continue on the rest of the way and get the rest of our main caps put on. The one thing I kind of like to do with these is tap them into place with a soft mallet rather than try and completely draw them down with the bolts. Just seems like a better idea that way. Now we'll just snug these up and then we'll start our torque sequence. We'll take these up in a couple of steps. I'm going to start from the center and work my way out. I'll take them up first about 45 and then we'll go on up to, take them up to 70. 60 to 70 is the torque range. And you just go until your wrench clicks. And of course, I haven't mentioned this for the benefit of those maybe not so inclined. You set your torque spec on the wrench here. You pull this little collar back and you turn this until your lines, your marks line up. Like this one is in 10-pound increments. It starts at 50. So with it on 0, and it may be kind of hard to see, but if you're on the 50 line and 0, that's where you're at, it's 50 pounds. And then as you turn around, you got 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to your next increment. In 1 pound increments. So and we'll just go on like so. Just a gentle click, there's what you get out of these on the low end of their torque range. Then just go over them one more time. Okay, the crankshaft is in. And of course, I just want to give her a spin. Make sure that it's smooth and you don't feel any binding. Now, this pre-lube or this assembly lube is really thick and it's kind of chilly out today, like in the 50s, so you know this thing's not just gonna spin freely, but that's okay.